Late October 2018, in a shallow creek bed threading through the Methow River Valley of north-central Washington state, a wildlife transport team opened 4 wire crates and stepped back into the cracked, powdery silence of a waterway that had not run in summer for more than 20 consecutive years. The animals moved low and deliberate across 3 kilometers of exposed cobble and bleached root, and you could see, even in those first minutes, that they were reading something in the ground the humans around them simply could not detect. A faint capillary pool of moisture still hiding in the clay beneath the stone. My name is Dr. Raymond Finch, and I spent 40 years documenting ecosystems in the process of dying, and occasionally, against every model I trusted, in the process of coming back. I have never seen a recovery begin as fast as what happened in this valley, and I want you to see exactly what 4 animals did to a watershed that had forgotten how to hold water. The creek had been functionally dead since the late 1990s. Every summer, the flow vanished completely, leaving behind a 3-kilometer scar of baked sediment and willow stumps that had not leafed out in years. 20 summers of zero flow is not a drought. It is a structural failure written into the landscape one dry season at a time. Within 72 hours of the release, not 2 weeks, not a month, but 72 hours, the team's field observer recorded the first willow stems being notched at the waterline. The release protocol had not anticipated active construction behavior for at least 14 days, given the documented stress of translocation. The animals were already working. Now, think about what that means for a moment. 4 animals, freshly transported, physiologically stressed, dropped into a landscape offering almost no standing water. And their first instinct was not to rest or orient, it was to build. The biological drive to engineer was stronger than the shock of displacement. Dr. Sarah Kovar, a wetland hydrologist contracted by the Methow Beaver Project, had installed soil moisture sensors along the creek margin 48 hours before the release, expecting flat readings for a minimum of 30 days while the animals settled. On day 4 of monitoring, her instruments registered a measurable uptick in subsurface moisture that stopped her mid-sentence during a field call. You are probably wondering right now whether those sensor readings were a calibration error, a fluke of local rainfall, or something the instruments misread. And the answer to that is coming, because the data Kovar pulled over the following 6 weeks is the reason this story exists at all. Stay with this. What the sensors had detected was a lateral moisture migration moving outward from the first small dam the Beavers had begun assembling. A capillary front spreading through 560 centimeters of riparian soil in under 4 days. In hydrology, that rate does not appear in standard recovery models for degraded creek systems. Here is where the data stops being data and becomes something else entirely. Because what those 4 animals triggered in 96 hours was not a hydrological anomaly. It was the valley remembering a process it had been running without interruption for thousands of years before we arrived and drained it dry. The plumbing was never broken. The engineers had simply been removed. Drive Route 20 through the Methow in late April, and you will see willows budding along the bank, a robin working the gravel, maybe a thin ribbon of cold water catching the light. And you will call it healthy, because it looks exactly the way a living watershed is supposed to look. But the surface of an ecosystem is the last thing to confess the truth. And the baseline surveys that teams ran between 2014 and 2017 in this watershed were not reading the surface. They were reading 60 centimeters down, where the verdict had already been written in dry, compacted, lifeless soil. I want you to hear these numbers one location at a time, because each one is a separate verdict. In the upper Methow watershed, groundwater depth had fallen more than 4 meters below the historical average. The alluvial aquifer that once kept meadows saturated through August was bone dry by July. Along the Twisp River confluence, willow and cottonwood recruitment had collapsed by 70% across 3 decades, leaving bare gravel where seedling colonies once locked new soil into place every spring. In the lower Beaver Creek tributary, the channel had incised, cut downward, by nearly 1.2 meters since systematic trapping ended in the early 20th century, dropping the waterline below the root zone of every plant that once depended on it. Across the adjacent Okanagan Highland drainages, summer baseflow had reached functionally zero by late August in more than a dozen monitored channels. No seep, no trickle, no cold reserve to carry anything through drought. That 70% drop in woody riparian recruitment was not gradual background noise. It represented 3 decades of bare gravel bars accumulating where seedling colonies should have been stabilizing stream banks and shading the water cold enough for fish to survive the summer. The creek was not sick. It was a drainage ditch wearing the costume of a living waterway. And the insects and birds and cold water fish that depend on slow, stored groundwater had been registering their objection through absence quietly for years, while the road traffic on Route 20 kept right on passing. This is the part that made me stop and reread the field notes. Dr. Sarah Kovar, the wetland hydrologist contracted by the Methau Beaver project, who had installed her soil moisture sensors 48 hours before the release, told me in 2019 that the most disturbing number in her entire pre-release survey was not a species count. It was the reading at 60 centimeters depth, pulled in mid-July 2018, indistinguishable from the agricultural plateau above. Not diminished, not stressed, but gone, as absolutely dry as tilled farmland that had never held a water table in its life. That single reading at that specific depth is what convinced her, before a single beaver had been loaded into transport, that this watershed had already crossed a threshold most restoration models categorize as functionally permanent, a line they typically advise managers not to spend money trying to reverse. You are probably asking the same thing Dr. Kovar was asking herself in October 2018, standing at a sensor post with a clipboard and 4 years of grim baseline data. If the aquifer is already gone, if the channel has cut itself 1.2 meters below the root zone, what exactly are 4 animals supposed to do about that? The answer is coming, and it will rewrite what you think recovery is physically capable of. Because what the surveys between 2014 and 2017 had actually produced, without intending to, was a precise before photograph, a 0-hour baseline so detailed that when Dr. Kovar pulled her 6-week data set in late 2018, the comparison was not approximate. It was measurable, documented, and impossible to dismiss. That measurable, documented comparison did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived against a backdrop of 15 years of human effort, engineered intervention, and serious money spent trying to solve the exact same problem by force of will. State and federal agencies had poured an estimated $2.3 million into conventional riparian restoration across the Methau watershed, root wads anchored by hand, native grasses seeded across bare banks, willow cuttings pressed into soil that had no moisture left to receive them. The willow plantings in the most remote sections ran roughly $800 per plant installed, each one requiring irrigation support for 3 consecutive years just to survive long enough to be counted as established. By the 5th growing season, survival rates in the driest sections had fallen below 30%, not from poor technique, but from a simple physical fact. No planted willow survives a July, with the water table sitting 4 meters beneath its roots. Then there were the 47 wood frame check dams, structures built to slow flow and lift the water table in 2 monitored reaches directly above each frame. They worked modestly in those narrow zones, but sediment loading degraded every frame on a 2-year maintenance cycle, and not one of them could relocate when conditions shifted upstream. Here is where it gets interesting. What those 4 animals built in their first 90 days cost exactly nothing, required no permit applications, and held through the first major rain event without a single maintenance call. You are probably asking yourself, if the outcome data was this clear, why did it take so long to get 4 animals into that creek? The Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife formally opposed the Methau Beaver Project's 2017 reintroduction proposal, citing unacceptable flood risk to an irrigation diversion serving 3 family farms downstream. That concern was real and documented, and I am not dismissing it. Dr. Kovar told me the regulatory opposition pushed the release back by nearly 14 months. 14 months that consumed another full dry season in a valley that had no surplus of them left to spend. 14 months. Another summer gone. What the agency opposition exposed, unintentionally, was the central tension this entire project was navigating. A valley in systemic collapse on one side, and legitimate human infrastructure on the other. Dr. Kovar's 6-week sensor record had already begun answering the flood risk question with field data rather than engineering models. And what those numbers showed about lateral moisture movement and dam permeability is exactly what shifts the conversation in the act that follows. 3 weeks into November 2018, you could stand on the bank of Beaver Creek and watch something that had no business being there. A pond, still and cold and spreading, where cracked silt had baked since July. 4 animals had built a single dam, a 4-meter-wide porous lattice of alder and mud. And it was already backing water 60 meters upstream, pressing it sideways into the floodplain with a persistence no check dam ever managed to sustain. Within 14 days, the soil moisture sensors buried at 60 centimeters depth, the same instruments that had read bone dry through the summer, registered a measurable increase across a 40-meter lateral band running along both sides of that pond. By week 6, Dr. Kovar's monitoring well, positioned 120 meters from the pond's edge, recorded rising groundwater, a distance nearly 3 times what the project team had modeled as a realistic first-season limit. The slow water pooled behind the dam dropped roughly 3 degrees Celsius below the adjacent free-flowing channel. And if that sounds modest, you need to picture a steelhead fry in August, searching for the one cold refuge left in a warming valley. At the 90-day mark, aquatic invertebrate sampling pulled mayfly and stonefly larvae from the pond sediment, where the pre-release survey had found functionally 0. This is the part that made me stop and reread the field notes, because what those larvae represented was not a recovery, it was a signal. You are probably asking yourself whether a handful of invertebrates in pond mud could genuinely rebuild the food web of an entire valley. And that answer is coming, but you need to stay with what spring 2019 showed before you decide. Riparian songbird species counts in the 500-meter restoration rose by a documented 34% over the prior year's baseline in spring 2019. Wilson's warblers, common yellowthroats, and McGillivray's warblers recolonizing vegetation that had been too sparse and too arid to hold a nest the season before. The beaver did not restore the creek, it restored the water table, and the water table restored everything else, in a sequence so precise, so layered, and so fast that every field biologist on that project had to revise their recovery timeline downward by at least 2 growing seasons. What 4 animals built in 18 days without a permit, a budget, or an engineer set in motion, a chain no model had predicted at this speed, and what that chain did to the valley's soil chemistry and fish population by the end of year 2 is a number I want you to see with your own eyes. That number I promised you. By the end of year 2, the colony stood at 11 individuals, and the project team's original model had predicted 4 animals holding a 600-meter active zone. What they got was something the spreadsheet had no column for. By spring 2019, there were 7 dams spread across 1.4 kilometers of channel, more than double the projected count, occupying more than twice the anticipated reach, and the colony showed absolutely no interest in slowing down. The project boundary had assessed the upstream reach as unsuitable. Low woody vegetation density, the official language said. The colony disagreed with that assessment and expanded 900 meters upstream anyway, harvesting every viable willow stem within reach. That expansion eventually reached a private landowner's property at the northern boundary of the restoration zone, where 3 ornamental shrubs were harvested. Cleanly, efficiently, and without apology. A formal complaint followed. Then a site visit. Then a conversation nobody had scripted. Dr. Sarah Kovar, the wetland hydrologist who had been on this ground since 48 hours before the release, told me that the flooded reach upstream of Dam 5 had submerged approximately 0.8 hectares of a working hay meadow, the same meadow belonging to one of the 3 farming families who had raised flood concerns from the beginning. She said the negotiation that followed was the most difficult month of the entire project, not because the farmer was wrong about his loss, but because he was not wrong. The irrigation head gate required a $4,000 repair. The footpath along the eastern bank became impassable for 7 months of the year. These are not footnotes. They are the honest accounting. A $4,000 headgate repair is a real cost paid by a real person. And if this work is going to be trusted by the farming communities it needs most, that cost cannot be treated as an acceptable externality. Recovery does not negotiate with property lines, but the people managing recovery have to. You are probably wondering at this point whether the project team considered any of this a failure, and the answer to that question is more layered than a yes or no can hold. Stay with me through what happened in the summer of 2021, because that is where the ledger balances in a way nobody saw coming. By the summer of 2021, the groundwater recharge event driven by those 7 structures kept the creek running through August, for the first time in more than 2 decades. Not a trickle, running. In the month that had killed it every year within living memory. The colony read the hydrology, not the map. And the hydrology turned out to be right. What that running August creek did to the fish population downstream, and what Dr. Cover's final soil data revealed about long-term recharge depth, is what the next chapter is built around. The fish came back before anyone filed a report about them. Small native cutthroat holding position in the cold current of a creek that, 24 months earlier, had been nothing but cracked silt and dry cobble baking under an August sun. Willows seeded themselves along the bank, not planted by a crew with shovels, but dropped by birds that had followed the insects hatching out of the new pond surface. And the insects had arrived because the water had arrived. And the water had arrived because 4 animals understood something about this drainage that we had spent 15 years trying to engineer from the outside. Dr. Kovar's final monitoring report for the 2021 season is not a long document, but one number in it stopped me cold when she sent it over. Soil moisture at 60 centimeters depth, reading above field capacity across a 2.1 hectare zone for the entire month of August. She told me, and I want you to sit with this, she would not have believed that number if she had not installed those sensors herself in 2018. 48 hours before the animals were released. The instruments confirmed what no model had predicted, that moisture was not sitting at the surface where a warm afternoon could evaporate it. It was held at 60 centimeters below ground, locked in the root zone, available through drought in a way that no surface irrigation system in the valley could replicate for any practical length of time. You might be wondering at this point whether this outcome holds, whether a single good season is evidence of a permanent shift or a fortunate anomaly. And that doubt is reasonable, and the data that answers it is exactly what I want to show you next, so stay with me. The law underneath all of this is not complicated. Water does not abandon a landscape voluntarily. It leaves when the structure holding it is removed, and when that structure returns, the water moves back to exactly where it was always trying to go. 4 animals. No engineering contract, no concrete, no pumps. A valley drinking again after 20 consecutive dry Augusts. And the only budget line that mattered was the one that covered the release. Drop your region and one species you have personally watched disappear from your area in your lifetime. One animal or plant you remember as a child that is simply no longer there. And yes or no in the comments, have you ever seen something come back that you were certain was gone for good? Because if the answer is yes, I want to hear that story. Share this with someone who still believes the damage is permanent because the evidence says otherwise. I'm Dr. Raymond Finch. I'll see you in the field. Next, I am taking you to the floodplain of the River Taff in South Wales, where a single otter family recolonized 14 kilometers of channel after a water quality threshold crossed in 2009 triggered riparian tree recovery visible on satellite imagery within 5 years. The Environment Agency of England and Wales opposed reclassifying the Taff as self-sustaining through 2017, a decision that withheld funding from 3 adjacent restoration corridors for nearly a decade. The unresolved question is whether a species that returned entirely on its own can ever be formally recognized as recovered by the institutions that decide what recovery means.